Here, Albert.
Years.
Sorry about that.
Landscape architects. And we're joined tonight with a couple of members of the Connecticut Institute of Resilience and Climate Adaptation, or CIRCA. John Trzynski and David Murphy have joined us this evening. On our team, Jeffrey Morrison Logan will be leading us through this for the engagement. Edwina Lamb, our lead stormwater engineer. Megan Gibbons is our civil engineer, and Ellie Peterson is a landscape designer. Next slide.
Great. So in terms of how tonight's going to work, we're very much looking forward to having a great conversation with you about a lot of topics about your community. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about this project and the project overview. After giving you a little bit of the lay of the land in terms of what this project's trying to do, we're going to break down into about 4 or 5 different conversations. We'll spend a little bit of time tonight talking about heat and heat risk and what that means to the community on excessively hot days. We'll talk a little bit about flood and flood risk, especially what that means to different parts of the study area from the north, central, and to the south zones that we'll talk about, and how we might be able to strategize around different solutions about making the future more resilient and more beneficial to the community as you think about flood, sea level rise, and all of those risks. At the end, Lorraine will talk about next steps, about where we are in the process, and forecast the next couple of public meetings where we hope to hear a little bit more from you about strategies and implementation and priorities from the community as well. So with that, let's get started right away and dive in. And Lorraine, you want to talk about the project and get us grounded?
Thanks, Jeffrey. Yes, just as a little bit of a background of why we're here, the state of Connecticut formed the CIRCA through a collaboration with the University of Connecticut and the state of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection back in 2018. The program was in direct response to the evidence of climate change, as well as the catastrophic events of Hurricane Sandy on the region. And this program is a regional planning tool developed to establish resilient communities through forward-looking planning within the New Haven and the Fairfield counties. What we're looking at right now is the Resilient Connecticut, which is one of the CIRCA programs, and it focuses on the coordination and collaboration between government agencies, municipalities, businesses, and residents to develop plans for guiding strategies and planning, and give a roadmap for recommendations for those 2 counties, but also beyond for the rest of the state. As the main tool to achieve the goal, Resilient Connecticut started in 2018, started a 3-phase effort. Phase 1 looked at the entire study region within both counties and established a framework. Phase 2 assessed flood, heat, and social vulnerability with the region, and then identified 63 resilience opportunity areas. And then from that, they went on to phase 3, which is really building on the first 2 previous studies. And that's where we are right now. And it's focused on 7 selected municipalities for pilot studies that will look at specific implementable concept plans. And South Norwalk is one of those selected communities. Next slide. So phase 3, which, as I said, we're in the middle of, we're going to focus on heat, flood, and social vulnerabilities. The study area has large sections of impervious pavement and reduced tree canopy. It's adjacent to the shorelines of Norwalk Harbor and Long Island Sound, with the effects of higher tides and other storm-related flooding. It's within an area that the city is focused on for affordable housing. And it's also in proximity to the train station and some of the city's transit-oriented development housing projects. Next slide. So let's get into the study. Our study area is centered within a diverse and vibrant neighborhoods of South Norwalk, surrounded to the north with Day and Water streets, moving forward to the south to Meadow Street, which is to the west, and then further south down along Woodward Avenue to Longshore Avenue. And the goals for the project were really threefold: to develop innovative ideas and strategies to reduce and lessen impacts of climate change, and to do that focused on heat and flood impacts within the study area in South Norwalk. And for the third really is to determine stakeholder and community member priorities, and that's why we're here tonight. In order to study the area in closer detail, just to understand this graphic that you're looking at, we've subdivided the project area, and you'll see this throughout the presentation. We subdivided it into three study zones. We have the North Study Zone, which is has distinct characteristics and climate impacts. And the North Study Zone is comprised of the marina and industrial waterfront development along the harbor. Also has multifamily housing and apartments within this area, such as the Soundview Landing and Harborside Sono apartments. The Central Study Zone is a mix of single-family residential areas as well as industrial offices, and particularly the residential areas between Meadow Street and Woodward, so very different land uses. The Southern Study Zone is more single-family neighborhoods like Harbor Shores and Harbor View. It also includes the Woodward Park and some industrial warehouse facilities, which also the Woodward Park has a sanitary sewer pump station. There's also quite a bit of wetlands in Woodward Avenue to Longshore Avenue, and Longshore Avenue being the single connection for Manresa Island property, as well as Harborview and the Village Creek neighborhoods. Next. Thank you. So we're here tonight to present and to discuss the existing and the future heat and flood conditions for the study along these roadway corridors and throughout your neighborhoods. As we continue into our presentation, we'll ask you about thinking about what ways extreme heat and flooding impacts you. And we'll have as Jeffrey had mentioned, we'll have the dedicated breaks in the presentation so that we can hear about your concerns and your questions and ideas. Next. So we're going to talk about heat. Next slide. So we've all felt the changes in the number of hotter and more humid days, especially last summer. When we look towards 2050, the average temperature is predicted to rise 5 degrees. And the number of days over 77 degrees is predicted to rise from what it is now, which is about degrees would be 81 to 118. We're going to prepare for hotter days, hotter nights, and more heat waves. So some questions as we move through here to consider. So when we start to discuss it is, are you experiencing health impacts surrounding the change in temperature? Are there obstacles to maybe getting to cooling centers? And have you gone to one in the past, or would you consider going to one in the future? Do you think there are enough trees that create some shade along sidewalks and around parking lots in your neighborhood? Are there large areas of pavement near you? And are they surrounded by buildings that might block some breezes from the waterfront? Are the roofs and pavement surfaces around you, do they seem like they're a darker color that might absorb heat? So as we review the data about heat impacts, we can see that some of the areas are definitely more affected than others. And to kind of look at that in more detail, I want to pass this over to Ellie Peterson, who's going to discuss this further in detail for the study area. Ellie?
Perfect. Thanks, Larry. We can move to the next slide. Awesome. So first, we're going to take a look at records of land temperature. So this map that you're looking at shows local surface temperatures relative to regional mean temperatures, which means that all areas that are visibly red that you see are above the regional mean, areas in yellow are about average, and then the cooler tones are all below average. And this will allow us to see areas that are heating at a much faster rate and can help us study land use that contributes to rising temperatures in those areas. As you can see on the key on the left side, temperatures shown on the map range from about 3 to 7 degrees above average in this part of the city, which is considered quite high. And it's important to note while we're reviewing this, that Circa and the city of Norwalk have implemented a heat study this past summer that collected data from 13 different locations around the city. And 2 of those locations, the fire station number 5 and the South Norwalk police station, are within our study zone and marked on the map in that teal color. And the purpose of this program is to measure how people on the street level are feeling heat, experiencing heat, in hopes that this extra data can supplement satellite information as temperatures continue to rise in Norwalk. Next slide, please. But when we're thinking about the issue of heat, it's important to consider how these risks disproportionately affect some people and communities more than others. NorwalkConnecticut.org has a lot of really great resources for what to do during a heat emergency, and also really helpful graphics that educate on heat impacts, such as the image that you can see on this slide. And examples of some populations that are more vulnerable to heat impacts would be pregnant women, which can experience adverse birth outcomes due to heat exposure, children and newborns who are less adaptable or less able to regulate their body temperature, and older adults or people with chronic health problems, which may have pre-existing conditions or take regular medications or live alone or have limited mobility. However, beyond this list, other populations are important to consider as well, such as people who experience homelessness or people who regularly work outdoors, or simply people who can't afford the utilities of keeping their house cool all summer long. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, moving back over to the map, in this study, we thought it would be helpful to zoom into areas within each of our study zones to determine how varying types of land use throughout the city can affect increased heat vulnerability, while also keeping these communities in the forefront while we're discussing some of these key issues. Next slide. So for the first example, we have a slice of Upper Water Street, which shows the conditions of a multifamily residential unit on one side, and then the semi-industrial zone along the marina on the other side. And in this location, temperatures were recorded at about 7 degrees over average, which is considered high. And there's a number of factors that can elevate heat in this scenario. For one, reduced tree canopy or other shade structures creates just more opportunities for heat to reach the land surface. Large buildings can contribute because they often absorb heat and block wind from circulating. And then as shown on the marina side, darker surfaces such as large areas of impervious paving absorb heat. Next slide. So next we're in the central zone, and we chose the example of a residential neighborhood on Woodward Ave. And this area also experienced temperatures of about 7 degrees over average. And although more areas were planted overall, there is still limited canopy along the road. And another factor to consider in residential areas, kind of in general, is how increased atmospheric pollution and waste heat via HVAC systems contributes to rising temperatures as well. Interestingly, ACs actually influence air temperature more significantly at night, and therefore people without them are even less likely to experience the relief that they would ordinarily get at night. And of course, there's an awful irony in all of this, because as temperatures rise and hot days become more common, people will rely on home cooling systems even more frequently. And you can move on to the next slide. And so then lastly, in the South study zone, we looked at a strip on Longshore Drive that passes through protected open space and coastal wetlands. And this zone was heating at a much lesser rate despite its proximity to urban areas. And this is due to it being a far more resilient area with increased green space and tree canopy. Also, wetlands reflect heat and therefore warm at a much slower rate. So with some of these examples in mind, we thought we would move into our first discussion period to end and open up to questions.
That's great. Well, thank you for that, Ellie, and thank you for that, Lorraine. As Ellie just mentioned, we'd love to pause here. I know there's probably a lot of questions this evening about a lot of different topics, but we thought we'd pause here and talk really about heat vulnerability and what that means to the different neighborhood. And as Ellie mentioned, we really understand that in different parts of the neighborhood, the contributing factors are very different from the north, middle, and the south, and what's around your local conditions. But it's interesting to look at how much heat is created that's above the average here as well. So with that, the way that we're going to get this to work for this first session, and this will be similar for the next three, is that folks that would like to participate by coming off of mute, joining the conversation, giving us your comment or giving us your feedback or asking your question, you can raise your hand in Zoom. Look for that function in Zoom to be able to look at the dialog box, raise your hand, and what we'll do is we are going to call on you.
Levanta la mano y nosotros lo vamos a invitar.
Oh, Thomas, I think you need to be moved into the translation.
Oh, you hear me? Yes, I do.
So let's pause there and just ask for Michelle to see if you can help move Thomas into the room. And maybe, Thomas, if you can come on video for a second and give us the thumbs up, that way we'll know you're moved into the room successfully.
Beautiful.
That'd be great. And while we're waiting, maybe Thomas, you can actually translate as we've just been doing until you get the thumbs up from you. But we're going to invite folks to come on audio by raising their Zoom hand. All right, so it looks like Vincent's going to step in here and keep it going. Okay, so maybe in the background, Michelle, if you could help move Thomas in, but Vincent's going to keep going in the background. Great. So thanks for helping out with that, Vincent. So again, if you want to raise your hand in the Zoom platform, we'll be able to call on you. Love to get the conversation going live with everyone tonight to be able to talk about your topics. Look for that Zoom raised hand. The other way that you can participate this evening is looking into the Q&A function, which is again on the Zoom dialog box. Click on the Q&A, you can type in your question, and we'll be able to call on our team members to be able to answer those questions as we go. So giving people a few seconds to raise their hand and we'll call on you as you come in. I know we had a couple of questions, some are a little bit more generic about the number of participants and people that have registered. So we're delighted this evening that we had around 100 people register for tonight, and we have close to 60 people participating on the meeting this evening, which we're delighted about. So very excited about that as well. So let me dive in and again, post those questions again about heat and vulnerability, and let's go to the attendees and let's start talking about getting folks involved here. So let me go up here. And I think, Michelle, if you could help me unmute, I'm having a little bit of a challenge unmuting the person that has their hand raised.
Sure. So Richard Harris has his hand raised.
Great. So Richard, if you'd like to
Just have to unmute.
unmute and join the conversation.
Hello.
Hi, yes, we hear you.
Did you have a question or comment, Richard?
Not at the moment, no.
Okay, great. Just wanted to check in. Saw the hand raised there, so that's fine. Looks like Diane, would you like to join in the conversation? We'll invite you to unmute.
Yes, hello. I don't know how to become live as far as my video, but you see my picture.
That's right.
I don't know how to do that, but
That's
anyway,
okay.
thank you so much for holding this discussion as the first of many. I'm an environmental consultant by trade, work on public health issues, both with citizens as well as companies. I'm here tonight as a citizen, having lived in Norwalk for 37 years. I lived at Village Creek and Harbor View at many points in my time in Norwalk. I currently do not live in South Norwalk, but I hope to move back. I was also on up in South Norwalk, closer to the center of town for about a year and a half, most recently. The reason I wanted to just mention something about the heat vulnerability, which is so important, is the following. There are many sources of air pollution in the areas that you mentioned, especially Woodward Avenue as well as Meadow Street. And of course, that adds to the already the problems, because I have found my friends have said that they do not want to open up their windows to get some fresh air because of the pollution of both atmospheric or air pollution as well from some of the sources on Woodward and Meadow and Wilson, but also from the noise caused by traffic, trucks, and that, of course, affects their homes. They often have to have much higher energy costs. And even then, they're just moving around the hot air indoors. They are afraid or don't want to open their windows when they can. Secondly, I wanted to make sure that we begin in our across the board new zoning regs that we include green roofs, not just, it's very good that you have the causation of dark roofs, but the city and those of you consultants that are helping us, please advocate for the city to include green roofs using succulents and also lighter rooftops, even for those buildings that currently stand that have dark rooftops. They could at least, if their roof structure cannot accommodate a green roof, they could at least accommodate a white roof. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. Very helpful. Good, very good comments too. So, Lorraine, let's take a break while we're waiting for folks to raise their hand here and maybe join the conversation to go over to the Q&A. Are there any?
Absolutely. Yeah, this first question, there was a reference to Hurricane Sandy hitting Norwalk. And Joe Schnarlin notes that the storm had been downgraded to a tropical storm when it hit Norwalk. This has significant implications beyond what actually happened.
Right. So we'll be spending a little bit of time talking about flooding, sea level rise, level of storm event, and what that actually means as you go through the different categories and the different what's called 100-year event, 500-year event, and talk about some of those future conditions. But how each of these storms are classified and how long, frankly, they stay over top of Norwalk as they're going through the system could have a catastrophic events, even if they're much lower level storms as well. Was there another question, Maria, or comment?
Looks like the next one was how many people registered for this webinar. I think we've answered that. The one beyond, are you presenting this project to show how you are mitigating current heating, flooding, and health risks?
Right, so tonight is really about showing us the community existing conditions and talking about the contributing factors. We're going to come back at the next public meeting and showing you some alternatives and some solutions. So we wanted to start with a little bit more of an open sheet of paper and get the dialogue going to make sure we understood what's happening locally, to hear it from the community first, and then we're going to be coming back again, second public meeting, with some solutions and proposed interventions throughout the entire area.
Okay,
Great.
let's go down to the next one. Are developers and businesses on board with this study and committed to receiving and acting on feedback? One example, a local design firm funded by the city redesigned the Washington 50 building with almost zero tree conservation. i.e. they cut down old trees, which were mature and lovely, and even initially loaded a new fountain area with dark pea stone, making the area even hotter. Willfully negligent.
Right. So it's a good question. You know, as things change, and I've been doing this work for about 25 years, there's been a lot of different initiatives over the years that would change zoning, that would think about things like sustainability, affordability, sea level rise, and those types of things. So as we're all getting used to planning for our future about what climate change looks like, frankly, some of these are relatively new topics that communities are dealing with. So, and to be honest, through the Circa program and the 3 phases of work that Lorraine talked about, Connecticut's trying to be very progressive in having these conversations with the community. So can't talk to the specifics of who's on board or who's not, but just know that this is a current conversation. It's a very relevant conversation, and that we're using projects like this and studies like this to build the awareness around what needs to go into it. So as you're seeing these drawings here on the screen, coming back and showing what the needed interventions are, whether they're zoning or public investment or strategies for the private sector to be able to do things, all of those are important to the conversation. Let's see, has anyone else raised their hand? Michelle, I'm just going
You've
back to
got
that
one
list.
more, I think.
Great. So you want to, if you could help me out, Michelle, I'm not seeing that as that happens on my end. So if you could ask the person and have them come off mute.
Sure. For a hand raise, we have Emily Berneman. I'm just gonna unmute you. If you just unmute yourself, you should be able to speak.
Hello, hi everyone. I'm Emily Berneman. I'm a commissioner with the Norwalk Bike Walk Commission, and I'm also a resident in South Norwalk. I live right on North Water Street in the Ironworks building. And I just wanted to quickly add to what Diane said earlier about the green roofs. I think that's a really good idea. And I just wanted to mention that in one of the buildings, in my building in Ironworks, we have garden bins on the rooftop. And I thought that was a really good idea, again, to get more greenery around those buildings. But I also wanted to mention, because I do volunteer with the Norwalk Tree Alliance and restoring the tree canopy on Washington Street specifically. I know there are trees that they're trying to, integrate into the street there, but a lot of what we're seeing and what you've presented in your presentation here is that with the rising heat levels, these trees aren't really surviving. They're really getting, damaged, dehydrated, and they're not thriving as they should. How can we, accommodate and restore and mature these trees that we're trying to plant in these, growing heat index areas? How is that going to be sustainable and, make that work? So I just wanted to bring that up as well. That's what I'm seeing in our area.
Great.
Excellent.
Well, thank you for that, Emily. That's excellent feedback. A lot of the work that we do as consultants is trying to design places they'll stand the test of time, frankly. So understanding some of the challenges around planting trees and irrigation, are they drought resistant types of things that we're specifying, and working with DPW departments as they have maintenance programs and installation of tree programs, for example. I think it's those types of things that we'd want to use during the study to go back and understand some of those standards. I know Lorraine, as a landscape architect, understanding the specifications and what's needed to irrigate those things. Maybe spend a second talking about the importance of those standards as we move forward.
Yeah, it definitely in an urban area that's, every city has these challenges about maintaining the trees and making sure that they're getting enough water. And it has a lot to do with the amount of soil that they're able to grow in. And there's, everyone is looking at new and innovative ways for urban canopy and urban tree details to be put in, to be installed. So I appreciate that comment.
Great.
Particularly.
Excellent. So Michelle, do you want to go to the next person? Let's raise their hand.
Sure. We have 2 more people, Donna Smirtopoulos.
Donna, well, we're inviting you to unmute on your end, so you have to accept that invite from us if you'd like to join the conversation. Maybe Michelle, you can try one more time to invite.
Oh. She was there.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Welcome, Donna.
All right. Hi,
Hello.
thank you. I'm glad that the previous speaker mentioned the tree canopy because I believe we invested an additional $1 million in, it was probably ARPA funds in building up the tree canopy. And what I see, I live in Shorefront Park and I walk on Water Street frequently. I walk on Woodward. I see a lot of trees that are not doing well and they're not thriving simply because it's too hot. They're neglected. If you, I don't know if anybody on the steering committee has done a walkthrough of Water Street, but what you will see is newly planted trees, they have no room to grow. I walked by there yesterday and somebody had tried to carve out a little more space around the trees, but what good does it do to plant trees and then just walk away and assume that everything is going to go to plan? So I don't think we should be throwing good money after bad here. And also, I just have a couple housekeeping questions. If you can explain what your company does, because I'm not clear on that. I have a vague idea of what Circa is. I'm not sure what AECON is. I think you're a government contractor, so you were awarded a contract to do this. I know
Sure.
that HUD was involved in this. And HUD, interestingly, was also involved in Soundview Landing. So we took the most vulnerable population in South Norwalk and they had their housing had to be rebuilt because of flooding and we put them right back in the flood zone and HUD was part of that. So I would, if you could untangle it, and also if there are any stakeholders who live in neighborhoods like mine who are on the steering committee, because I think you should have some. So you have, you have boots on the ground here.
Sure. Great. Well, thanks for the questions and thanks for kind of doubling down on the tree issue. And you're absolutely right that the maintenance part of it is very critical. So maybe what we can do is, I'm not sure if Michelle or Steve, if you want to talk about city-related efforts as part of this. But in terms of who we are, this is a great opportunity. I think John or David, if you want to join in and give a soundbite about who Circa is, and then we can answer like who AECOM is in supporting this whole effort. So John or David, do you want to join in?
Sure. So Circa is a research institute at the University of Connecticut. And we were awarded a grant through the HUD National Disaster Resilience Competition to do a regional study of Fairfield and New Haven counties. And the purpose of the study was to do a vulnerability assessment and develop projects, resilience projects in vulnerable areas of the two counties. And we're working with across all of the state agencies, and we're also working with a number of municipalities, including City of Norwalk. And AECOM was a team that responded to a request for qualifications and was selected based on those qualifications to lead this particular study. And I'll let the AECOM folks fill in the rest about what they do.
Thank you for that, John. Yeah, so we're a company that's frankly it's worldwide, but we're represented in many local communities. But what's really intriguing about a project like this is having planners, landscape architects, civil engineers try to help the community and the state understand the dynamics that are happening that are contributing to these issues and plan for the future of them. So this is very much a planning study that we love doing and working with communities to vision your own future as well. And I think they might be able to just spend a second, either Michelle or Steve, from the city programs and the maintenance and the funds that were spent on the tree. I'm not sure if there's a soundbite you'd like to add there.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that in terms of the dollars spent and what the source of those funds were, but we can definitely find out and get that answer back out. I think we have everybody's email address, so we can provide that information as needed.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Steve. Appreciate it. Yeah, we might not know all the answers tonight, but thank you for bringing them up, and we'll try to make sure we get those incorporated in the second public meeting. So I think let's go to the last person who had their hand raised, and I think we have about 3 or 4 minutes left on this session. Then we're going to go on to the next one. So do we have another person, Michelle, or are we all set with folks that have raised their hand?
We do have one more person, Joe Schnurline. He's just unmuting now.
I'm good.
Hey, Joe.
Good evening. A couple of quick comments and something to think about for future planning. Many progressive states have decided not to build in areas of flood. And they do it for a multitude of reasons. One is once they start flooding, even though people may be elevated, you're constantly paying for repairs, you're constantly paying for breakdown, and it puts first responders at risk if they have to go in and evacuate people. And here we are in Norwalk doing just the opposite, looking to plan large buildings that could house many, many people. And the other point I want to make is I think right now, a good portion of Norwalk is absolutely furious with Eversource. And we're talking about green roofs, and I totally understand why you have a green roof. But if you have a green roof, you don't have solar panels. So there's got to be a compromise here. I just want to throw that out in the process of the planning. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Yeah, we're all about listening tonight too. So our team is actively taking notes about these comments and looking forward to continuing that part of the conversation. So appreciate that, Joe. So why don't we spend maybe 2 more questions in the Q&A, Lorraine, and then we're going to go on to our next topic. So I know we have about 6 or 7 of them here, but we're going to keep on attacking them.
Yeah, so the next one in line was from Louise Washer. Is there data on how changes in tree canopy affects heat in terms of what percentage canopy change is needed to bring down numbers like what we're seeing? What should our canopy goal be in order to bring heat down to 0? Sono currently has something like 15% canopy, as I remember, according to Westcog study. So that's a question that we can look at for the next our next stage and be able to review that.
That's right. And I think as Ellie pointed out here, and looking at the words that are pointing to these drawings, there's many contributing factors. So knowing that tree canopy is one of many here, we'll be able to come back and talk about when you intervene by doing more, what are some of the benefits of doing that and how might that affect the drop in temperature as well. So great question. Is there another one, Lorraine?
Let's see, looking for a question. Ellen Peck. Ellen Peck, FWIW. This redesign was just last 2 years in Sono, funded by city. I'm not sure what FWIW is. We'll go to the next one. Steve Hunter. I've observed that it's a result of storms and subsequent fallen tree damage that a real fear of trees has taken hold, and many trees have been removed. There are also several property management companies, such as IVE, have a policy of removing all large trees when they take over a property. Is there some way to combat this?
Great. Yeah, again, I think it's one of those things that we can look at too. Part of it might be standards that the city has in terms of development standards. So when you come in to do a project and a proposal, clearly there's a need to get your site ready, but are there certain standards that can be put in place about replacing some of the tree canopy or thinking about it maybe a little bit more critically than what's happening right now? So good question, good comment.
Well, and the city may be already doing this as far as assessing the trees themselves, what's the age of them. Once they get older, they are under stress and may suffer from some breakage. So, and then coming back through and planting new ones. So
great. So Lorraine, I'd suggest let's move forward. So thank you for this. This is the first one of 3 more to go here. But again, the focus on this one was heat vulnerability. We really appreciate that. So if you want to keep the questions going too, feel free at any point in time to add to the Q&A, and we'll come back to those as well. But let's go on to the next part, onto flood risk.
Yeah, so so now we're going to talk about the flood risk. And next slide, please. We looked at the existing and future conditions for flooding vulnerability within the project area. As we probably, some of us have heard, sea level rise in Connecticut is predicted to rise 20 inches in mid-century in 2050 and to continue to increase even after that point. One thing to think about is that small changes in mean sea level have a big impact on the frequency of flooding. So current day, right now we think of flooding in a minor, moderate, and major flooding thresholds, but they'll occur more often, so that minor flooding will become the mean higher high water. Moderate flooding will occur more frequently, more annually. Major flooding will occur probably every 2 to 3 years in 2050. So definitely frequency is an issue. And when we were looking at this, we divided this into generally 3 sources of flood conditions. Each of them contributes to the accumulation of surface water within the project area. So we can expect the source of flooding to be from storm surge, higher tides from the Norwalk Harbor and Long Island Sound, increase in precipitation amounts, and again, as I mentioned, frequency of storms, or possibly inadequate capacity flow in the drainage system. And probably more likely, it's really a combination of all of these factors that contributes to current and future flooding. Next slide, please. So we've shown all of our flood limits based on 100-year flood maps as modeled by Circa. But when you hear about the range of flood events referred to often as like 25-year flood, 50, 100, 500, it's really terms of, just as a little moment of definitions, it's a terms of level of risk. It's not terms of years. So a 100-year flood describes the statistical likelihood of an area being flooded within any given year. So it's like a 1% chance or 1 out of 100 chance of flood for any given year. Next slide. So what does it mean for our flood area, for our study area? We've shown this map, which is the future conditions, 100-year flood modeled for 2050. This, as we mentioned, it's a 100-year flood. It's 20 inches of sea level rise. And one thing to think about when we look at this also is that when you look at this mapping, it doesn't include any contribution for any drainage issues. So this is just mapping for the 100-year flood. And I'm going to pass this now on to Megan Gibbons, and she's going to walk us through discussing storm surge and also the stormwater infrastructure for our study area. So Megan.
Thanks, Lorraine. You can flip to the next slide. So storm surge is the abnormal rise in seawater level during a storm. And so what I have here is a very zoomed out picture of the location of South Norwalk within the Long Island Sound and further out the Atlantic Ocean. So typical air patterns in a hurricane travel counterclockwise, and the hurricane is shown by that white circular twisty thing there. And so storms traveling inland have wind patterns that are pushing counterclockwise, and the effects of each storm varies on strength and landfall. But if a storm is in, for example, the location shown, water is getting pushed from the Atlantic Ocean into the Long Island Sound, where it's going to end up getting trapped, and the water will pile up within that Long Island Sound and by South Norwalk and move on to what is normally dry ground. So we're going to look at potential patterns of storms along the coastline of South Norwalk and how it affects the flooding there. Next slide. So here is a hurricane surge inundation map, and it shows the hurricane storm surge and each storm's potential flooding. So the severity of potential flooding is, again, dependent on each individual storm. So no 2 storms are the same, but you can see how the more severe storms flood further inland. It's important to note that for example, a Category 3 storm, which is that yellow bar there, the flooding area also includes the green and the teal colors as well. Next slide. So starting with this map, we're going to look at the North Study Zone first. We are assuming with the graphic here that this is the 100-year storm event. There is a 20-inch sea level rise for the future 2050 conditions. Just as we saw in the previous slide, the shape of the coastline greatly affects the storm surge flooding. So if we look at the coastline at a more zoomed in level, you can see the pockets or indents in the coastline where water can also get trapped and pile up and move inland. Here, coastal surge is potentially affecting the marine and industrial waterfront areas. Next slide. So this is a continuation of the same map. This is the central study zone. Here, the neighborhoods of Shorefront Park, Harbor Shores, and Harbor View are potentially affected from storm surge events. The surge is also able to extend from the Long Island Sound up through Village Creek and flood from that direction as well. Next slide. Moving on, this is the South Study Zone. So based off the coastline here, water can be trapped and begin to flood inland from two directions. The first is via the marsh area located east of Norwalk Harbor, and the second is up by Village Creek that extends from the Long Island Sound. Next slide. So this is a little bit of another definition slide here. So we want to talk about pipe capacity and how pipe capacity affects flooding that you may see in your neighborhoods. So pipe capacity is the volume of water that can freely flow through a pipe. So a typical drainage system is designed with the pipe sizes increasing as we get closer to the outlet, or in our case, the harbor. So we kind of want to think about it the same way as you would think about traffic. So imagine if you're on a 3-lane highway and you now have to merge onto a single ramp. Because the water is now because the traffic is now merging into a smaller lane, the water or the traffic gets backed up, similarly to how the water would get backed up. And it causes the water to get pushed further back into the drainage system, or in the analogy I'm using, the highway, and it will pool up and flood in your neighborhood because water is not able to move freely through the pipes. It's problems like this that we're going to be looking for in the existing drainage system that we have throughout South Norwalk, and we will talk more on that and solutions for that in future meetings. Next slide. So as Lorraine mentioned in the beginning of our flood talk, is that the flooding that we see is really a combination of a bunch of problems. So on this map, I have compounded the flood arrows that you saw from the storm surge directions, those blue arrows that we can see, yes, from the harbor. And I also mapped out some existing drainage networks that we have within South Norwalk. So each drainage network is a different color. And the red arrows there are showing the direction of flow that water flows to take all the way out to the harbor. One thing that I want to point out in this North Study Zone is the difference in sizes of pipe networks. You can see here that the purple network is much larger than some of the other networks here. And so we will be analyzing this network in particular to see how much volume of water it has to handle, and we want to see the capacity that this system needs to have to be able to effectively drain the area.
Megan, could you take a second and just point out the outfalls, because that's an important part of this overall system?
Yes, so the outfalls I've circled with the corresponding color to the drainage network. So you can see on this slide, we actually have a few. And so the outfall is basically where we're trying to drain all of the water from storm events too. So if we have an outfall, we can once again take this purple pipe network into consideration here. If we have storm surge that is signified by that blue arrow pushing up into that divot where the purple network is going to eventually outfall, and we have water from inland trying to flow out, you can see that it comes to like a head-on. You could again use a traffic analogy. You can't have two cars going down the same street without having some backup or slowing down issues. We can move on to the next slide. So this is the central study zone. You can see a little bit of the purple network, and you can kind of see how our maps are flowing together here. So once again, this is just a map showing the combination of the drainage networks and the storm surge. And this map is the South Study Zone. same thing that we have been viewing. We're looking at the storm surge in combination with potential drainage infrastructure issues. So now I'll turn it back over to Lorraine.
Thanks, Megan. That was great. So now we've talked about storm surge and we've looked at drainage infrastructure, and we're going to really move on to 100-year flood, flooding from rainfall and storm events. As you can see, again, this is the same mapping that you've seen before. This is the model mapping of a 2050 condition with 20-inch storm level. And the flooding extends around the Day Street and the Water Street neighborhoods. It surrounds the center of Shorefront Park and Harbor Shores, and the Harbor View neighborhood will have extensive flooding. Woodward Avenue and the industrial area adjacent to Village Creek wetlands through between Meadow Street also have various levels of flooding depending on the elevations. Next slide, please. So as we started looking at the, again, the existing and the future conditions, that would potentially impact the zones, we've decided to select a series of representative locations with each of our subzones. So we'd really take a closer look and compare current flood limits with the future. And the locations really represent the different land use conditions to assess like various scenarios, so that when we look at the next stage and we look at mitigation and some concepts, we have some good examples of varied land uses. These locations are identified, as you can see. There are 7 of them, and they're all numbered. And then we've looked at that in more detail. So next slide, please. So looking at the North Zone, next slide. As we did for the heat section, again, we subdivided into the project into the 3 zones, starting with the North Study Zone at the north end with Day Street and Water Street. And we have 2 locations that we have selected for the North area. These 2 locations are representative of the neighborhood because they include the waterfront along the marina and with the industrial land uses. And this area also is just currently being reviewed through the recently completed Norwalk Industrial Waterfront Land Use Plan. Across the street on number 1 is the Soundview Landing Development. And this site design elements, this has a number of site design elements. It's so new that really kind of address resiliency. So I thought that would be a good example of a location to look into. Number 2 is further south on Water Street. And on the west side, it's an office building with a parking lot. And on the other side of the street is a city-owned property building. It's the 2nd taxing district. I think it might be a DPW building. The next slide. So this map shows the area with current, the last one with future sea level rise. And next slide. And this is future, and it also, we're adding some photographs just to kind of bring everybody to understand exactly where these locations are. Next. And this is the southern location on Water Street. So we've got the 2 locations, so the northern end with Soundview Landing and the southern part of Water Street, which is by the DPW building. So we're going to move on. Ellie Peterson is going to talk a little bit more detail about these next illustrative graphics that show a no flood condition and the change with a 100-year flood in 2050 with a sea level rise. Ellie?
Perfect. Thanks, Lorraine. So a little disclaimer, I'm hoping to move through these graphics fairly quickly so that we can have enough time to discuss them. with everyone. We have a lot of visuals to show, and they're really here just to help us brainstorm some ideas and observations and get the conversation started. So for the first one that we're looking at tonight, it's in the North Zone, and Lorraine already started to speak to some of these. This graphic probably looks familiar because it's the same that we visited during the heat study. And it shows the conditions of the multifamily residential unit on one side of the street, and then the marina industrial conditions on the other. The first image shows no flooding, and then the second explores the worst case scenario of the 100-year storm in 2050, which is just a arbitrary year that we are predicting this storm could take place. Next slide, please. So this slide zooms into the street because we can see that that's where the flood is impacting most heavily. And here it's just important for us to consider how major city circulation might be affected by flooding, as Water Street remains a key corridor along the waterfront. Next slide, please. Then we just move a little further down Water Street, still in the North Zone, showing differing conditions of municipal and private businesses. For context, this section is located right by the Public Works building. And same as before, the first image shows a scenario of no flooding, and then the second image shows the scenario of the 100-year storm in the future. Next slide, please. And so again, flooding continues to impact Water Street most heavily. And so circulation challenges could continue to be a consideration here. Clearly, local businesses would be affected as well. So we might consider how limited parking or access might affect those populations. Additionally, we may have more flexibility with land use shifts in this particular location due to it being public property. So we may consider more localized flooding mitigation, such as pervious paving or expansion of planted sections to include bioretention beds, for example. So now you can move on to the next slide, where we'll open it up to our second slot for discussion on flooding.
Great. Well, thank you for that, Ellie. Really appreciate it. So here, as Ellie mentioned, we wanted to use these two case study locations to talk about some of the dynamics of flooding when we look out to 2050 and some of the different elements of your street that are impacted. So it's interesting. We love to hear the comments from folks that, you know, understanding the North Zone. What is it like to walk down these streets during a flood event? One of the original slides that Lorraine shared showed what it looks like when it's flooding, impacting sidewalks, the roads, the cars, the marine industrial that's on the waterfront, and obviously during an event, what do folks need to do in this area? So love to confirm what's happening and making sure we're getting these graphics right and hear about local issues so that when we come back at our next meeting, we can talk about some of the changes in intervention. So let's open up to the conversation again. Again, reminder to raise your hand. We'd love to get some of the conversation going live here as well. We can obviously post some of your comments here. So maybe, Lorraine, as you're going through those, we'll try to hit the ones that are about flooding in terms of the Q&A this time as well. And we also have a resource map here as well that we want to talk about neighborhood issues in addition to these two typical zones. We'd be happy to talk about anything in this northern district as well as those two case study locations. So with that, let's start on the audio. So Michelle, who do we have that's raised their hand? You want to invite them to come off mute?
Sure. We have Lori Jones.
Can you hear me?
Hey,
Yep.
Lori.
So Jeff, hi. First of all, thank you so much for this amazing work. So I live in a community called Wilson Point, which is just west of Village Creek. And I'm just curious how you chose the border. We are a South Norwalk neighborhood. And we're a coastal neighborhood. We definitely suffer from flooding to the point that in December in that storm, we could not get out of our front gate because of the flooding on 136. So I would just be so appreciative if you could shift your border zone a little bit west and include our part of South Norwalk. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate the comment.
All right, we have one other, I believe.
Great.
Diane Larchella again.
Hey, Diane, welcome
Yes.
back.
Yeah, thank you. This of course is near and dear to my heart. I forgot to say I also lived on Taylor Avenue. That was my third location. Anyway, related to the flood risk, I was very involved when the determination was made properly that Washington Village had to come down and be demolished because of the constant flooding and mildew, and the structure was not embracing healthy living. And so I was in favor of that part of the plan. What I was not in favor of was the way using federal, state, and local money to place buildings, in this case, mixed income development, which again, I'm in favor of, but not in favor of placing it near and in a park that could have instead be used to absorb floodwaters. I attempted in my best. I know there was a lawsuit. There were all sorts of controversial discussions with the previous redevelopment agency staff, all of who are no longer here. There was, because our congressman was able to secure $30 million, which was no small feat, and I was happy that he did that. I sat down with him in a diner and said, you know, this is not good community planning for flooding to allow buildings like we see in the slide here back within the flood zone, and that there were other places where we could move these mixed-use zones that were owned by the city, like Webster Street. There were other areas around Ryan Park that could have been used in addition to it, but not on Water Street. Also, I asked ACOM to take a look at a major project that seemed to have just been abandoned on South Water Street back around the 2000s. The DPW was supposed to consider raising South Water Street, but it's a rumor. But because I know, as in my background, there were some oil tanks in the marina area and they had leaked. So when they started doing some digging, they ran into oil in the ground. Allegedly, that is why the whole project was abandoned, and they did minor drainage improvements. Also, some of us during the time of the Washington Village debates stated, why can't we raise parts of South Water Street and include flood check valves in the storm drain so that water would not back up into the pipe system. I really like a lot of your graphics, so it really helps explain some things related to that. And lastly,
Sure.
I just wanted to say that increasing true green infrastructure is a way of absorbing the floodwaters and releasing them slowly, because green infrastructure helps cool down the waters, clean up the waters, slow them down, and release them slowly back into the sound. So thank you so much.
Great, appreciate that. And thanks for that. Multiple things there. I think one of the interesting parts of many of the things you said is the idea of these interventions over time, right? And that's partly what I love as a planner and urban designer. That's, you know, in my career, while I might be 30 to 40 years, there's only so much things that I can affect in those years, and sometimes it takes 100 years for these things to change. So the idea that you're talking about is these interventions over time, when they're happened, how they're funded, and anticipating the future. It's been, frankly, an interesting dynamic to watch over the last couple of decades. what's interesting to me about that redevelopment site that you mentioned, they've actually raised parts of the road in that area to deal with some of the localized flooding. They've done strategies like putting parking at lower levels versus habitable spaces at lower levels, and put in some retaining walls at the edges of buildings. So as an architectural solution, it's kind of interesting to see how you're dealing with those things. It might not be the longer term that you have envisioned, but it's interesting to see how projects are starting to deal with them on a block by block basis. So what's interesting to us about the study is that when you think about projects over time, DPW interventions over time, you'll eventually start to attack the problem for the longer term. So thank you for reminding us of maybe where the city's been, some of the challenges in negotiating and talking about those projects. But I think what we're doing with this study is trying to forecast the next round of investment, the next round of strategies that can be deployed to kind of add to your kit of parts and add to your toolbox to attack this for the long term. So I just wanted to point it out because this is going to be a long-term strategy and probably a multi-pronged strategy too, as well. So just wanted to take a moment to mention all of those. So really appreciate that. So let's go on to the next couple of people. Let's do maybe one or two more on audio, and then Lorraine will go back to you for some of the Q&A
Okay.
this second.
So we have Gail B.
Yes, thank you. So first of all, let me echo some of the prior comments. I'm really enjoying this presentation and seeing what you're studying and how you're looking at it. I'm not aware of anything having been done to this extent before, so that's super helpful for those of us who've been wondering about the direction and what the city might be doing to take into account some of our concerns. I live in Shorefront Park, and so many's the time that I've been trying to get home at the end of a workday only to find Water Street completely flooded and blocked off. And it's sure it's much worse for the people who live there and have to deal with it on a regular basis. One question that I have is, do we know yet whether or not the city has adopted any sort of a moratorium or a I guess slowdown of new development in this area until this study is completed and the recommendations are received?
Not sure of that. I'm not sure if Steve or Michelle could answer on the development side if there's any status of development or any moratoriums that are in place.
No, there are none.
Great, thank you. Gail, was there a part two to your question? Just want to make sure.
Well, no,
it
would seem to me that folks on this phone call who have the ability to influence that decision ought to take that into account if we're doing all of this work to see how we can remedy some of these issues that are being studied. I don't think we want to go changing the landscape while the study is still in progress, which seemed to me to be a waste of time and energy. So I think, you know, as a resident in these areas, I would certainly like to see some consideration being given to the fact that while the study is ongoing, it would probably be a good idea to at least slow down any proposed additional development.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that, Gail. Michelle, who do we have next?
We have Catherine Snedeker.
Very good. That's a hard last name. So I've lived for the last 30 years in this slide, actually the bigger slide. I lived 27 years in Harborview. I lived 4 years in Shorefront Park, and I'm now on Haviland and Water. So I have a 30-year perspective of this. And Water Street is called Water Street because it's floods. And honestly, you can't stop stupid. And they even put the largest sign up that said, "Don't cross the floodwaters." You can actually stand there and yell at people not to drive through salt water, and they're still going to do it. So that's really about the city putting out containers to try to deal with that. But people still drive around the big areas. this situation, I think, is gaining interest because wealthier people have moved in. Certainly after I lost part of my house in Hurricane Irene, I was out of the house for 8 months rebuilding Hurricane Sandy. Say about probably over half of the community has changed, and there are wealthier houses, wealthier people, wealthier cars. So I do think that there is some push for that and like making changes, but we sort of always lived with the flood conditions. The thing that really concerns me is that we're now looking at putting the new South Norwalk School on Meadow Street in a flood zone. And why are we building a school and in an area that floods on a sunny day? And I have pictures of all these areas flooding with high tide, full moon, high tide, sunny days. So there's like a tide issue, there's a moon issue, there's a flooding that doesn't even have to do with storms. It's just those combinations. So I just hope that this all, and now we're going to ask kids to walk through flood zones. So it's that Meadow Street section kind of on the edge of where you're looking, but that really is affected by all of that. And I don't think the Sound View did anything but protect its own people. There's nothing about making that road better in what they did. The road's not any higher. And the more people put up barricades, there have been beams built in Harbor View. There have been things that have been built by homeowners to try to make their land safer. And sometimes it makes it worse because it keeps the water in. So it's a great place to live. Love it. Thanks
30 years and counting. That's great.
Right.
I appreciate the local feedback. Really, that's what tonight's about. We just want to hear what the issues are and how it really works.
But those two sections you picked are very different. Section one floods on a sunny day. You rarely ever get water on part two.
Right.
So I have pictures and video right now of the slide one happening, people driving cars and getting stuck. Once you get to section two, you're out of water.
Okay.
No water there. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so let's go to, I think Donna is next, if I'm not mistaken. Then I want to try to get in 2 or 3 of the Q&A, and then we're going to have to move on to the central section next.
Sure. Bring over Donna.
Hi, thank you for letting me speak again. I asked a question in the chat window. I don't know if it was answered. And I realize it's probably not in the purview of the steering committee to look into this, but I do believe, and Catherine Snedeker was my neighbor here in Shorefront Park. To her point about signs, I actually do think we need signs on Water Street that people are driving in a flood zone. Maybe this will be part of your recommendations, but this seems to be a pretty soft ask. This is low hanging fruit if we put signs out so that people know, even on a dry, sunny day, that they're driving in a flood zone. And then secondary to that, it would be some sort of a system where people trying to exit, we have a problem with egress and ingress here in these neighborhoods, as I'm sure you know from your research. On a practical level, you're looking at long-term solutions. We need something now to help us. And so I think between signs and some sort of, using first responders or DPW to set up detours so that when we make that right turn onto Water Street, we know before we make the turn that we're not gonna be able to pass through. And you probably know, again, from your studies and your photography, that it is a blind turn. And so, if you're trying to get to Westport, Connecticut, and the shortest way is Water Street, and it's not passable, you don't know until you're already on it. So I think there are some very inexpensive, doable solutions that the city can embrace. And I think with your recommendation, they would embrace and not have to wait for the study to complete before they start doing it so that we can experience some relief here. Thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you, Donna. I appreciate that. And I think in the Q&A, David, did I see that you wanted to maybe answer 1 or 2 of these? So happy to maybe check off a couple of those as well.
Yeah, I've been trying to keep up with them, Jeffrey, and I think I've got a few that are left over that the city would need to address. There are 2 that relate back to previous discussions, and then there are a couple that relate to flooding.
Great. So are there any that would like to answer live, or do you want to just continue to do that in the chat, in the Q&A?
I don't know. It's hard for me to tell.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
I'm happy to type responses into the questions if you want.
Great. Yeah. So for those that are looking in, go back to your questions. We're actually typing in some of the answers as well as answer them with as well. So Lorraine, any on this subject that you'd like to point out? A couple questions?
Yeah, there's one question here or statement from Joe Schnerlin. Sorry, Joe, if I'm not got that right, but on some of our floods, a concern is not only how people get in and out of an area, but also what washes ashore, such as vessels and docks. Depending on the depth of the water and wind, these can slam into buildings, fences, as well as other vessels. So I think that's a good point that hasn't been brought up.
Yes. Were there others, Lorraine, or are those the big ones?
We've got one from John Pinto. Future planning in the city has not adequately considered or demonstrated an understanding of the state's Coastal Management Act and the Municipal Coastal Program.
Great, thank you for that comment.
And then we have an anonymous attendee. Will the steering committee suggest posting signs in the flood zone? This question was not answered live.
Right. Oh, whether we can do that or not. Yeah, it's a great question. We'll obviously look into a lot of these things. So thanks for that suggestion. We'll take a look at it. And it's typical that these types of studies, while they are long term, we're doing them for a reason to be able to make actions out of them. So the whole idea is this is one step, but we want this to be a very actionable plan that might need some time to raise money and get things into place, but also having champions and sponsors who will move these different projects forward. So we always look for those interim steps that while you're waiting for time or for money to show up, what are the things you can do for shorter dollars and highly implementable things to help out in the short term? So love those comments as well. All right. So any other major ones before we move on? Because it'd be great to go down, same exact topic, same exact issues, but we'd love to go to the central district because we realize that they're very different issues as we go north-south. Okay.
No, I think, yeah, we can move to central. Okay, so yeah, again, we're making our way from north to the central area, and in this study area, we looked at 3 representative locations in the neighborhoods. Again, because we're looking for areas that have land use variation within the central study zone. So the location on number 3 includes a residential neighborhood with single family homes. It's close to the intersection of Woodward Ave and Meadow Street. And it's for those who live there, it's close. I believe it's the CNS grocery is right there. Location number 4 on Meadow Street is right adjacent to fire station number 5 and Novak Street. And we chose that because it seemed representational. It's got 2 commercial industrial businesses across from each other. They have large areas of pavement, both for parking as well as like out storage area, outdoor storage area. And the location number 5 on Woodward Avenue is right near Neptune Avenue in the Harbor Shores neighborhood. And this includes single family residential homes on the east side of the roadway. And across the street are larger warehouse commercial buildings with lawns along the roadway, and then large pavement areas adjacent to the Village Creek wetlands in the back. Next slide. So that was existing conditions, and we can see the difference when we flip to the future 2050 conditions, the extension of the flood zone. And next slide, please. And again, these next 3 slides will show just some photographs of the area, just so people can be reminded what areas we're looking at and how different the different land uses are for each of these study zones. So we'll go on as we did before. Ellie will continue to present and look at the closer look at the no flooding and 100-year storm contrast.
Okay, thanks, Lane.
You're welcome.
So for number 3, we are in the central zone. And as Lauren had described, yes, sorry. I thought I was in a different presentation. Right, as Lorraine had described, this is showing the conditions of a single family residential neighborhood on Woodward Ave. It was the same section that we had been looking at during the heat study earlier on. And again, the same format as before. We have no flooding on the top image, and then the bottom image shows the scenario of the 100-year storm in 2050. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. This section shows a fairly typical scenario of flooding for this area. And I'm going to be really curious to hear some of the comments if anyone who lives here is present tonight, where it's predicted that the majority of the homes will be significantly impacted during a future flood. As this is a residential area, any mitigation effort locally would have to be done in the right of way. However, this could lead to an interesting conversation about how we might be able to proactively address the source of where the water is coming from outside of these neighborhoods. Next slide, please. And so then for study 4, we're looking up Meadow Street at the recycling center, and this is near the fire station at this location. The first image shows a scenario of no flooding, and then the second image shows a scenario of flooding in the future. Next slide, please. And here we can see a higher impact of flooding due to the grades. As you can imagine, a lot of water comes down the slope and collects at this lower elevation. But in addition to this, it's evident that the concentration of paving here also just allows for very little relief during a flooding event. Next slide, please. And then for study 5, this was the last area that we considered in the central zone. And as Lauren had mentioned earlier, it's placed approximately where the WB Mason factory is, just off of Woodward Ave. And then on the other side of the street, we show a small piece of the Harbor Shores residential neighborhood. Next slide, thank you. And here the deepest water levels appear to be up on the west side, which leads us to believe that a significant amount of water is flooding up from the estuary, passing through Village Creek, as well as from the Norwalk Harbor, the Long Island Sound to the east. And so essentially from all different directions. And although part of this area, if you could just go back to the last slide. Yeah. Although part of this area is vegetated, it's mostly made up of lawn, which is surprisingly poor at absorbing water. So to give you some frame of reference, lawns, because of the grassroot structure and soil compaction, can only absorb about 2 inches of water per an hour, compared to more diverse environments that can handle up to 7 times as much as that. So with that, we can go into the next slide, and we'll again continue the conversation.
Great. Thanks again for Ellie. And that's why we wanted to make a distinction between these 3 different zones, knowing that the central zone has very different characteristics from the last couple of sections we've shown here. So just like last time, let's raise the hands, let's get the Q&A going here as well. And we can talk about this both in terms of the whole district, this kind of central zone, as well as general topics that are happening, as well as what's happening within these 3 specific typicals that we've looked at here as well. So let's go right to the folks that raise their hands. So Michelle, do you want to get our next person up here?
Yes. So I'll go to the first person that hasn't spoken yet. Sorry, I can't pronounce your name. Rashima?
Oh, Rashima.
Rashima.
Rashima, welcome.
Hi, thank you. I live on Meadow Street and right across from CNS grocery store, and we don't have a problem with flooding. We never flood. It's down the block by Water Street that always flood. It never comes through our area.
Well, that's actually very helpful feedback for us to hear too. But also as a reminder, on the bottom of a lot of these drawings that you see here, So we're anticipating a certain event, anticipating a certain level of sea level rise in 2050. So while that's good news that it's not happening today, we're also looking to our future to understand what happens with some of these potential climate change impacts in the future. So, but it's helpful to hear the existing conditions today. Super helpful. Do we have another person? Michelle,
Yes.
do we have to go to?
We have Donna again.
I think Donna, you have to come off of mute.
We have Donna and Diane with their hands up.
That was a mistake. I didn't mean to hit that. I apologize.
Okay. No worries. We won't count it against you.
That's right. No problem.
Sorry.
Great. So Diane?
Right, thank you. These were very interesting three examples. Just two general comments. The first is I agree with what Donna S. said about making sure we have some short-term solutions first. I agree with Lori Jones and some others, Linnell Jones, that please consider extending this study to include even beyond Wilson Point, if possible. I think it would be a shame not to, but my main comment is in the area of Meadow Street. Again, remember, I'm an environmental hazardous waste professional. As the water is rising, or should we have a flood event, which we will have. We're lucky we missed it last year, but we just lucked out that Sandy was downgraded and it was on the outgoing tide, my understanding is. So we can't, of course, depend on luck. And that is, we need to include in this study the possibility of increasing the enforcement so that all of the industrial and commercial concerns on Woodward and Meadow and Wilson have containerized and cleaned up their outdoor and indoor buildings of contamination, so that when, and not when, but or if, not if, but when we have a storm event, that it doesn't spread that contamination or material into the residential neighborhoods. Number two, consider please increased and strategic raising of roads. I used to live at Village Creek and Harbor View, and maybe there needs to be some thought, which I hope you will suggest so that we can begin deciding finances, and that is, where shall we raise the road so people have egress in case they must remove themselves from their community temporarily. But we need to strategically raise some roads that do flood regularly, even at times with full moon, as Ms. Snedeker said. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Diane. Appreciate that. Yeah, and the idea of planning for infrastructure versus education and awareness for property owners, and understand that these events are going to happen. So what are you doing to making sure you're minimizing some of those contamination and other associated risks if it does happen, unfortunately? So thanks for that. Appreciate it. So let's go to the Q&A.
Yeah, we've got some questions here. We have one from an anonymous attendee. Catch basins and storm drains in the study area are often filled with debris, including seagrass and rubbish, cigarettes, butts, cans, bottles, other refuse. It's been nearly 3 weeks since the last major flood in this area, and the Housing Authority's Soundview Landing has still not been cleared of debris. Would it be possible to encourage those who manage or own local properties to remove trash and debris before it becomes the source of the next flood?
Great. Very good comment. Piggybacks up on what we were just saying as well.
Right.
Was there others, Lorraine, here? Or
yeah, a couple more. Catherine
Okay.
Snedeker sent 4 videos on January 2nd, 2022 of Water Street flooding. So that was, I think, for David. And then Louise Washer asked, are there examples of cities requiring plantings other than grass to manage flooding on existing commercial properties? Ordinances that require trees and shrubs, does that exist anywhere?
Great. Yeah, so what's interesting is the idea of what's called stormwater management. So when there's a storm and when there's water, and how you manage that water both on your site or when it gets into a city or town system. A lot of communities are trying to rethink some of those stormwater standards and how they perform to try to really improve the situation, both from a quantity, like how much water, but also from a quality perspective. So the idea of things that are getting caught in the system and maybe contaminating things, for lack of a better word, trying to up the ability for quantity and for quality. And I think you'd find, if you went around the United States, different states and different towns looking to improve some of their standards, and understanding that this is a long-term issue that we're going to have to deal with in terms of how our stormwater systems work. So I think part of this would be working with Michelle and with Steve and other departments within the city to see if they have, longer term stormwater goals and objectives that might be applied both on private property as well as to the own systems that the city has as well. So great question. Others, Lorraine?
Oh.
Okay, great.
There's
Anyone
another-
else that's raised their hand? Because we have that one last section before we close out for tonight. But any other comments from the folks that are the panelists tonight on this section before we move on? Okay, well, let's go back to South Zone. Lorraine, back to you.
Yes. Okay, on to the South Zone. So the final two representative locations for the southern end, at the southern end of Woodward Ave and Longshore Ave, represent residential and wetland open space land use variation, typical of the South Study Zone. Number 6 includes a residential neighborhood with single-family homes at Harbor Shores, close to the intersection of Woodward Ave and Burl Street. This location is across the street from Woodward Park, Public Park, which also has a sanitary sewer pump station that you can see in the about halfway back on the north side. The designated location at number 7 on Longshore Avenue is typical of the roadway located between the marsh and wetlands on both sides of the roadway. And this roadway, as many of you know, connects the property at Manresa Island and the Harborview neighborhood, and so it's currently subject to flooding during a 100-year storm event. And this is a present day. And if you move to the next, we'll see this is the future with the 20-inch sea level rise change. And here are some photographs of, again, images of those particular locations. So we're going to start moving on. We'll have Ellie do the presentation of the detailed axons, and then we'll get on to discussion about this part of the study zone.
Perfect. So for study 6, we show the conditions of parkland, the Woodward Avenue Park, and then the residential context that it meets on the other side of the road. And go to the next slide. And again, here, the deepest water levels appear to be up on the west side, which helps confirm that water is undulating from all directions on the coastline. And then over time, as well as the park continues to flood more regularly, this could lead to damage of the soils and unusable portions of land. So it's, I think, smart for us to be conscious and consider how we might be able to reconsider this area so that it could be more tolerant of flooding in the future. Move on to the next slide. And so then the 7th study zone we looked at was Longshore Drive, which runs from Harborview towards the center of South Norwalk. And as Lorraine mentioned, cuts through open space and wetlands, which is anticipated to be extremely flooded in a 100-year storm event. Next slide, please. this section I feel really shows how resilient this corridor is compared to some other areas around the city. However, according to our storm surge analysis, water is expected to be flooding from both sides of this road and doesn't really appear to have anywhere to go. So I appreciated Diane's comment during the last Q&A where she was raising if there are any opportunities to raise the road at any point. This is a very important evacuation route for Harborview. So it might be an important area for us to consider as we look at all of these locations. So you can move to the next slide and we'll continue the conversation.
Great. Thanks for that, Ellie. So I think we've got the routine down here as well, so people can raise their hands, type into the Q&A, and I'm going to go to the larger map here because again, it's very different knowing that we're getting a little bit further removed, having the different water resources around these pieces of roadway infrastructure. It's a very different issue that we're dealing with to the south here as well. And so do we have anyone, Michelle, that's raised their hands here?
We have Lindsay.
Welcome,
Hi,
Lindsay.
how are you? I joined late, so my apologies if this has already been discussed. But in a past flooding discussion that I attended at City Hall one time, a couple of years ago, there was discussion of a pumping station on Lawrence Street that is no longer operational. Has that been discussed, or is there any opportunity to like reactivate that or repair it? Or is it even useful at this point? Because we know it exists and it's a little frustrating to know it exists and it's not helping us.
Great. I'm looking to Michelle and Steve. I'm not sure about the status of that, or maybe even Megan, if we know about any of those related facilities from the stormwater pumping. That's something we can come back to if we don't know the answer as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. We'd probably have to look into it further and get back to you.
Yeah, but great for bringing it up.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, Michelle, who's up next?
We have Joe Schnurling.
Thank you, Michelle. Couple of points. I was a school teacher for 33 and a half years. And the students I had that were from Harborview, probably 5 or 6 times a year at least, had the excuse that they couldn't make it to school on time because the road going into Harborview was flooded. And it did not have to be a storm. So as previously mentioned by other speakers, this would be a prime candidate to try and raise the road. The other point is people are talking about signage. Once upon a time in Norwalk, they had signs up that certain parts of Norwalk flooded. I heard unofficially from real estate agents that they should be taken down because it's affecting values of homes. And ironically, I traveled to Fairfield shortly after I saw them come down here, and they had them up. And basically, I talked to some of the politicians in Fairfield. They said they had them up to protect the citizens, because if somebody's moving into this area from outside the area, they don't understand this area. And this past year, all of us in Connecticut had a great migration from New York State, so they don't know what areas flood and what areas don't. And I wish I could say I could trust the real estate agents to point that out, but I was looking for a house at that time, and one real estate agent took me down to Harborview and said, you know, here's a prime candidate, it's within your budget. And I looked at her and I said, and does this area flood? And she said, oh no. And I pointed to the water line on the side of the house halfway up the door. So I know I can't trust everybody to give you the right information. So maybe the city can. That's it.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate those comments, Joe. Very helpful.
Okay. We have Jody.
Hi, Jody. Welcome. You'll have to accept our invite to come off mute.
Just
Maybe
have to unmute.
Hi, can you, hi.
Yes, we can hear you. Welcome.
Hi. All right, I am actually the person at the City Hall meeting that Lindsay spoke about, that brought up the pump station on the corner of Woodward and Lawrence. Meadow Street does not typically flood due to storm surge, but because of overflowing storm drains and that non-working pump station. I've had conversations with people in planning and zoning that are on this call right now. And they've said flat out that it is not in the plans to be repaired. It's incredibly disappointing to live in a neighborhood where we all have to pay flood insurance, a lot of money in flood insurance, where we know this problem could be fixed. Look, you know, we live here and we know that there's you know, flooding when there's storm surge and storms, but when the water is coming up from the storm drains and there's a pump station that doesn't work that could resolve a lot of these issues, it's incredibly frustrating. And I feel like if this study is going to exist, that non-working pump station must be a topic of discussion. There's no question about it.
Great.
And I just, you know, I've been, you know, this has been going on for years. This is not something that I've been talking to the city about overnight. It's been happening for years. And it's just very disappointing.
Well, Jody, I appreciate you bringing that up and confirming that. And I love it when multiple conversations get connected in a meeting like this. But as partly what hopefully you saw in Megan's presentation, we realize that there's an important factor of the stormwater systems and the sizing of the pipes and where the water can or can't flow. So I appreciate you bringing that up tonight. And I'm sure members of our team have put that on the list to double back on and check in on. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great. Michelle?
So we have Diane.
Thank you. This whole evening has been great. Look forward to future meetings like this. I just wanted to add that the relationship of raising of roads strategically, I am assuming, but maybe I should not assume, that there needs to be study of the off-site effects of raising roads to especially down gradient and side gradient neighbors. I forgot to mention that there have been not only rumors, but concerns back at the previous slide about the North Study Zone about Water Street, but this would apply to this area as well, is when and if roads are raised, especially with Soundview Landing. Yes, they took care of their own and they got a lot of federal, state, and local money to help with that. But other places that did get flooded with Sandy, and this was, again, we were lucky, but that is Concord Street, Calvary Baptist Church. Very, very concerned that with the Soundview Landing drainage work, there did not seem to be also study of the side gradient and down gradient effects of that drainage work. We can't, you know, and you all know, we can't do piecemeal. I save myself only. This is a great study now to do holistic, whole of government approach to our problems. Thank you so much for the evening.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Appreciate that. Yeah, so obviously the cause and effect factor. So if you're solving a solution here, does it push a problem somewhere else? So knowing that it's hard when you're pushing major pieces of water around, what are those implications? But I totally understand the question and the concern. So appreciate that. Okay, so Lorraine, you want to jump in on some Q&A?
Sure. We have a comment from Catherine Snedeker. You should superimpose toxic waste sites in these areas on your maps. That's a good comment. Jennifer Butler, for what it's worth, Longshore was never land. It's landfill. Harbor View was an island. Let's see. Again, Catherine Snedeker, we're extremely worried about flooding in this project. Oh, anonymous attendee, what's going on with the Ann Street pump station? No, it's out of the study area, but the pump stations seem to be an ongoing problem. For that. And that's all we have at the moment, unless I've missed one.
Great. Thank you
That
for
would
that, Lorraine.
relate to flooding.
Great. Okay, so like last call for comments that people want to raise your hand, because we have literally about 5 more minutes to close out for the evening. We want to share with you important upcoming next steps so that people can mark their calendars and think about where we are in the process as well. So last call for that before we move on. Looks like Catherine might have.
There we are.
Excellent.
Just want to jump in. I don't want to barrage you all with bunches of videos and photos, but we all have pictures, dated photographs with geolocation of, do you want to know what it looks like? Because like that section, the 2 sections that you have are like night and day of the sections that you've picked out from flooding right now. So we've got the data if you need it.
Great. I think, well, I would maybe, if this is okay, Michelle, maybe you can do some follow-up there to see, but we have a lot of resources, a lot of great data from the state as well. We always appreciate getting in the local information to supplement what we may not have. So I would say, yes, we'd love to get some of that information and maybe having a connection to Michelle at the city as one conduit to make that happen. That'd be great. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Probably not 1,000 photos, maybe 1 or 2, but that would be helpful too, right? Excellent.
Your best.
That's right. Okay, so last call on the Q&A, Lorraine. I think we covered the bases there.
I think yes, I don't see a new one. So
great. So let's go to next steps and a big thank you. This has been a great conversation this evening. So Lorraine.
This has been terrific. Yeah. So our next steps after tonight's workshop, our next steps include sort of reviewing all your comments, all questions, everything that we've received tonight. We can't thank you enough for that. And we're going to look at all of those. We're going to start looking at establishing priority locations and looking at mitigation efforts. Our next immediate step is to start looking and developing conceptual designs, alternatives, and adaptation options that address not only flooding, but flooding and heat. So this is from Circa, and as we look at, I thought this was a good thing to include as we start looking at options. This is their PERSIST decision support criteria, and I'm just going down the list. Is the adaptation and is the suggestion, is it permittable? Is it equitable, realistic, safe, innovative, scientific, transferable, and sustainable? And I think that says a lot just in that. Next slide, please. So our project, we started in about October, and the final report is due in May. So we're just shy of halfway point, right? That red arrow is where we are right now. As you see in the pink, we've got stakeholder engagement throughout the whole project. But we are in the yellow zone now. We'll start to look at, again, priority locations and develop different alternatives and start creating some concepts. And we'll have 2 more public workshops like this or similar to this. One, I think we'll probably look at March, and then again, probably very early in May, but we're setting those dates now. But that's where we are, and we're really looking forward to having you come join us and see what we've come up with after all of this.
Great. So thank you for that,
Thank
Lorraine. And Michelle, would you like to close us out for the evening with some final comments from the city?
Sure, yeah. Thanks everybody for joining tonight's meeting. This was great. Hopefully you all come back for the next public meeting, and I'll follow up with an email probably tomorrow to you all, which you guys will have my contact and share any resources and pictures and data you have. But thanks all for joining. It's been great.
Thanks, Michelle.